Thank you everyone for joining us today for our growing and maintenance of common fall and winter crops. Sorry about the glitch there. Our good friend Emma, who's been with us for so long, has moved on from Seth's events team. We have a new person with us. Her name is Calliope, and she's going to be doing the recording today and sort of watching the chat box if anyone has questions. But we had to create a new Zoom link because the other one was under Emma's name and we didn't have the code to become hosts. So that's where the confusion was. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to. Okay. So my name is Melissa Bell. I'm the Center for Environmental Farming Systems Liaison for Outreach, Education, and Research. We'll let John introduce himself.
Thank you, Melissa. I know a lot of you who are here today, but for those of you who I don't know, I am the Agriculture and Local Foods Extension Agent for Durham County. And yeah, this is I don't even know how many of these webinars we've done thus far, but this is always one of my favorite programs to be a part of. And we look forward to teaching you all about some things that you'll encounter in your fall garden. So thanks for listening. And Melissa, if you want to jump in.
Sure. Yeah, John and I are going to do it a little bit different today. We're going to be jumping back and forth between the slides that we each contributed. Calliope, if you haven't already hit record, like we said, this is going to be recorded. In your wrap-up email after the webinar, you'll get the recording. Please drop any questions you have into the chat box, and we'll try to address those at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So first of all, what can we plant in the fall here? So fall means planting in August through September, planting date, and we can grow things like arugula, beets, broccoli, cabbage, carrots, cauliflower, Swiss chard, collards. A lot of the things that we can plant in the spring, we also plant in the fall. Kale, kohlrabi, our lettuces and spinaches, mustards, onions, bok choy, radishes, turnips. We have a lot of things we can plant in the fall here. A lot of these we'll see can be grown both in the spring and fall, but maybe do better in the fall because we warm up so quickly here in the spring and things tend to bolt. So fall might be a better time for them. Today, we're going to be talking about broccoli, cabbage, kale, collards, all in the Brassicaceae family, and then lettuces, salad greens, onions and garlics, and beets. We're going to be talking about planting dates, days to maturity, planting and spacing, any unique seasonal maintenance that needs to be done, cultivation and harvesting. Then we'll look at some pests, diseases, and insects, and any soil concerns. This picture over here, sorry, it's a little grainy, but I wanted to, when you say kale, there's lots of different kinds of kale. My all-time favorite here, Jacinto kale, also called dinosaur kale, but there's also their common curly, Red Russian, Siberian kale. I just thought it was a cool picture to show. Before we get started, our planting calendars. Of course, our old favorite, the Cooperative Extension planting calendar. But I also like this one. This is just a visual showing you, this is for Piedmont. Things that you would plant in early August, cabbage, cauliflower, spinach. Whereas turnips and lettuce and mustard greens, you can plant all through August and even mustard greens into September. Head lettuce or kale in later August. And then our onions and garlics are going to be in September, even, garlic I plant in November. But this link I thought was super cool. Let's check out this link from Urban Farmer. We're going to get an ad pop up here. But I liked it because it had frost dates, and it has the hardiness zone that you're in. In Raleigh here, we're in, sorry, move this. In 7A, 7B, towards the coast, we're talking about 8A and B. So you can find easily what hardiness zone you're in, and then scroll down to this nice visual. Let's go to 7, planting schedule. So we can see if you're in zone 7, we've got beets and broccoli in the spring, with an early, late spring, early summer harvest, and then again in the fall, August planting, harvest in October, November. Same with cabbage and carrots. We have our summer crops, Then kale, and kale is spring and fall, as is lettuce. So I thought that was a really cool link. Let's get back to this one. Okay. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is in the Brassicaceae family. Also used to be called the crucifery family. The Brassicaceae family with the genus Brassica. The plant Brassica oleracea is broccoli, collards, kale, and cauliflower. That is all scientifically categorized as the same plant, just different cultivars. So over decades and decades of traditional plant breeding, they have bred to emphasize different parts of the plant. So this is the same plant, Brassica oleracea, but if you're eating Brussels sprouts, you are eating the lateral leaf buds of this plant. If you are eating broccoli, you are eating the flower bud and stem. If you're eating cauliflower, you're eating the flower buds. Kohlrabi is the stem, kale is the leaf, cabbage is the terminal leaf bud. Just super cool to know that that's all scientifically the same plant. And then we have Brassica rapa, which would be our bok choy, turnip, Napa, and Napa cabbage. So these are going to be planted in February or March, and then again in August through September for an early winter harvest. I'm a real plant nerd, and so I just thought this was super cool. If you're out in nature and you see a plant with these 4 petals and then 4 stamens, too short and too long, that is a brassica, or crucifery. You know, they form a cross. So 4 petals, and they produce these long pods when they're mature. They're known as siliques. So that's something in the brassica family. So broccoli. So we're eating the flower buds and stalk. The broccoli, as we know, really high in vitamins, high in vitamin A, potassium, vitamin C, folic acid, and fiber. These are planted in February for an April harvest or late August for an early winter harvest. They thrive in cool weather, so hot weather will cause them to bolt. So we often have a really pleasant May, but we often have a really hot May. So they do great in the fall. Pretty typical pH, 6 to 6.5, well-drained fertile soil, 6 hours of sunlight. We're going to plant transplants. So you're going to purchase transplants or start your own 6 to 7 weeks before you want to plant them in the ground, 18 to 24 inches apart. And then depending on the variety you have, we're looking at 60 to 80 days to maturity. So broccoli is considered pretty high maintenance. They need a lot of water and they need a lot of nitrogen. So with a big payoff, if you like broccoli, you need to water them well to establish the plants, and then water them at least every 4 to 5 days. And then as your head begins to develop, you're going to make sure it's watered well. They're considered heavy feeders. They're heavy nitrogen feeders. They need 150 to 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So you're going to want something that, you know, our 3 numbers here are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So you're going to want something that emphasizes the nitrogen. I would certainly want something that has some potassium in it too. But what 150 pounds per acre of nitrogen looks like on a small scale can be something like a half a cup of this 2100 per 10 feet of row. You don't want to put all your nitrogen down at once. You want to split it into 3 applications. So you're going to put this half a cup down at planting, 2 to 3 weeks after transplanting, and then again when the head is about the size of a quarter. Then you're going to harvest when the heads are firm and tight and dark green. That's what you also want to look for in the supermarket, that dark green, really tight heads. When they're a little bit past peak, you're going to start to see the flower buds opening a little bit, maybe yellowing. It's still edible, but not quite as tasty. Cabbage, that's the terminal bud of the Brassica oleracea plant. They need less nitrogen, but nitrogen is still important if you want that nice firm head. So you're going to, again, apply a nitrogen heavy fertilizer 4 weeks after transplanting or when you're thinning them. I'm sure whatever you buy will have, if you go to a local hardware store or plant store, It'll have how to apply that on a smaller scale, a half cup per 10 feet of row, 6 inches to the side of the plants. That's important. You never want to put your fertilizer directly next to the small plant. You'll burn it with the salts in the fertilizer. 6 inches away is a good, definitely if you're using drip tape, then you can irrigate that into the soil and it gets to the plant quicker. With cabbage, you don't want to apply nitrogen after the head starts to form because the head will crack. You harvest, look at the days to maturity on your variety. When the head is nice and firm, and you're going to just cut that head at the base from the plant. Kale, we're eating the leaves of the plant. I'm going to talk a little bit about kale, and then John's going to go into more detail. Again, really high in vitamin A, B6, calcium, folate, fiber. They can be planted as early as February, and then again in August. I definitely have noticed in my planting that you can have kale or collards all the way up to Christmas, especially if you cover them with row cover for that maybe surprise frost that's coming. But you can keep your kale going all the way up till Christmas. Days to maturity can vary. If you want baby kale, 20 days, 35, and then on and on. John will talk more about different ways to harvest kale. We're going to plant transplants 6 inches apart. I know you can grow kale from seed. I always grow it from transplants. Just gives the plant a better chance to survive. And then again, our varieties, red Russian, red boar kale, Jacinto, my favorite, common curly kale, or Siberian. So John's going to go into some more detail about kale, so I'm going to hand it over to him.
Thank you, Melissa. So yeah, I want to talk about some of the things you might encounter when planting kale, maintaining kale, and really just some of the things that you'll have to do to get the best crop possible. We talked a little bit about, and actually, before I get started, we had a question in the chat that I think now would be a good time to cover. Because I see Sarah Smith mentioned is planting meaning from seed or from transplant. And, it's going to be different pertaining to different plants. As we talk about more like root stuff later in this presentation, that is going to be direct seeding because you don't want to disturb, a root vegetable. But, there is some variability in, how you're going to be working with brassica plants. Um, Melissa mentioned, transplanting because direct seeding can be a little bit more difficult. In my experience with a lot of these plants, that is the case as well. Not, you don't have to do it that way, but you're probably going to get better and more dense uh, within your garden kale. So that being said, whether you are transplanting or direct seeding, more so with direct seeding, it's a good idea to plant your kale a little bit more densely than needed, and then eventually thin them, to about a foot apart, maybe a little bit less. If you are transplanting, you can be a whole lot more intentional with spacing than with direct seeding. So it's definitely worthy or something worth paying attention to. And like some of the other plants we're going to talk about today, specifically with a lot of these cool weather crops, well-drained soil is really important. Kale is a plant that likes a consistent degree of moisture. Um, and one of the things that Melissa and I like to talk about whenever we can is, environmental and cultural, maintenance practices that can hopefully offset some, more intensive extractive maintenance practices. So we'll talk a little bit about, mulching and some of the things that you can do to kind of regulate that water cycling a little bit better. But kale is a plant that would respond very well to, mulching around the plants to kind of maintain that consistent moisture. Um, I now want to talk a little bit about harvesting kale. So if we move forward one slide, let's see. There we go. Thank you. There's a few different considerations that are probably unique to kale and some of these cool weather brassicas that you might not encounter with either common summer crops or some other cool weather crops. One of which is that the flavor of kale, oh, thank you. The flavor of kale can be really influenced by the season. Cooler temperatures and lower intensity of sunlight can produce usually some of the healthiest, sweeter kale leaves that you will have. Also, harvesting mature leaves helps the plant to kind of continue producing throughout the season. So if you're looking for baby greens, harvesting, less than a month after, in this case, seeding, um, transplanting probably a little bit less than that. But if you're wanting mature leaves, it's not exactly the cut and come again practice, which we're going to outline a little bit more later, I believe, but pretty similar. Your semi-regular harvesting of the mature leaves can be a really good way to let those inner leaves grow to maturity for a later harvest. But you're probably not going to want to employ that if you are actively taking the baby greens. Um, so a similar plant to kale is collard greens. Same plant family, many of the same practices that you will need to employ, but also has some unique elements as well. Planting techniques for collard greens are really going to pertain to the stage in development that the producer wants to harvest them. Like kale, like a lot of the plants that we're going to talk about, um, preference for, size, maturity, tenderness, things like this, it's kind of subjective. There's a lot of ways to the top of the mountain, if you will. And if you were trying to produce, high quality, tasty, maybe marketable collard greens, then being mindful of, spacing and planting concerns for harvesting is pretty important. Um, if you intend on harvesting collards at maturity, then they're going to need a whole lot more space than if you're intending on harvesting them when they're young or half mature. And that being said, if you space them as densely as you would, for harvesting at maturity, like a big basketball size plant, but then you don't end up growing them that big before you harvest them, it can really be a waste of space. Which a lot of what we talk about is high density, maximizing efficiency, things like that. Um, so collards are one to be mindful of. If we move forward, I can talk a little bit about some of the, soil concerns and nutrient uptake concerns that collards will encounter. Um, Collards like a lot of nitrogen. I will preach about this over and over, but before applying fertilizer, know what your soil characteristics are. If you've got just a ton of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, anything, any of the macro or micronutrients within your soil. If you have a lot of that before you fertilize and you are blind to your existing conditions because you haven't done a soil sample analysis, then it's very easy to over fertilize, especially with nitrogen or phosphorus, which can be, pretty bad for the plant's roots in excess. So collards do need a lot of nitrogen. But also, as Melissa mentioned, we're talking about young, delicate baby plants. These are not tomatoes where they're on a vine and the fruit is way above the ground. This is a plant that very easily could get some of these, ideally not synthetic chemical fertilizers, but even if you are putting things that are really concentrated in, nitrogen, maybe bone meal or something like that, like you still want to try to side dress if possible, meaning putting the fertilizers on the side of the plant or the row as opposed to just directly, you know, not certainly not a foliar application, but also you don't want to put it just directly under the plant. So that being said, let me see. If you broadcast the fertilizer as opposed to just kind of dressing it, really easily on the side. You can avoid burning the plant foliage with a deliberate overhead watering afterward, just to make sure there's no fertilizer granules still on the leaves of the plant. Um, Let me see. Beyond that, let's talk a little bit about harvesting for collards. Um, Similar to kale, collard greens can be harvested in quite a few different techniques, depending on what the producer really wants the consumable final product to look like. Um, if larger leaves are something that the producer desires, then harvesting the whole plant at maturity, just cutting it and taking it, is the best, most efficient way to get the most value from that plant. For tender leaves, I mentioned that cut and come again process. Cutting a little bit, letting it grow back. Or you can also have a mature plant that is producing, mature full-size leaves. And then you can still regularly harvest those more tender leaves, and leave those big green solar panels there to soak up sunlight from the plant while you take the little guys. Lots of different ways you can do this. I encourage you to investigate further. Depends on if you're eating them, if you're selling them, what your preferences are. A lot of different ways to harvest your collards. Considering pests, Melissa, you want to talk about pests again?
Sure. Thanks, John. So yeah, I was going to talk about the brassica pests and diseases because they're all in the same family and they have the same pests and diseases. This picture here shows us a lot. We're talking about cabbage worms and cabbage loopers and diamondback moth loopers for the most part. We're talking about these larva worms that are going to be eating your leaves of your cabbage or broccoli or collards. So here this shows the moth, the cabbage looper adult, or the imported cabbage worm adult. You see these moths, little white moths flitting around all the time, or our diamondback moth adult, which produces these larvae that are going to be eating your plants. Oftentimes you'll maybe not see the larva, but you'll see the frass and then go looking for the larvae, which are often hiding right on the midrib of the collard leaf or the kale leaf. And they can do a lot of damage, mostly to younger plants, but they can just, riddle your leaves with holes and make it really unedible. You see one here, this imported cabbage worm larva on cabbage. There are two ways to deal with it, right? You can exclude these moths by putting row cover down in the early spring, May through June, or in the fall when you plant, and then they will not be. I think there's a picture later that has the eggs. So you can exclude the moths. They always lay their eggs on the underside of the leaf. You can go through scouting for the eggs and wipe them off the leaf, or you can scout for these larvae and take them off. I just always pick them and throw them. Or you can use BT or neem oil. Often BT works best on the larva. So this is a link here to Minnesota State Extension University talking about managing caterpillars on cabbage. It's a pretty extensive article that has a lot of really good information for you. Our favorite Alternaria leaf spot, back again, black rot or Alternaria, bacterial that affects most of the plants in the Brassica family. Really on broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower. We see this leaf spot again. This bacterium overwinters in infected material. So at the end of your growing season, you're going to want to remove all that brassica debris, all the kale leaves and the cabbage you want to remove from the field. Any mustard plants or weeds in the brassica family that might be surrounding your plot. It often comes from infected seed, so you want to try to make sure that you're buying disease-free seed or transplants. It's a bacteria. We want to make sure we're using good cultural practices so that we have good airflow, keep the soil off the plants. It likes high rainfall and high temperatures. So if you do get these leaf spot, say you want to remove the infected material, and then you can spray with copper fungicide, if you choose to, on the healthy leaves, so that it does not spread. Also aphids, we'll see a lot of aphids again. Insecticidal soaps can be effective for aphids. Even strong jets of water can be effective removing aphids, but they also have a lot of natural predators. Ladybug beetles, the syrphid fly larvae, parasitic wasps, lacewing. So, really great if you have a beneficial habitat around, or even some buckwheat or sunflowers, to keep some of these beneficials around. This is a great link for also Minnesota Extension Guide to Insects and Disease Control of Broccoli, Cabbage, and Cauliflower. Again, always, if you can, drip irrigation or watering at the base of the plants, or watering early in the morning so the plants have plenty of time to dry before nightfall. Good spacing so we have that airflow. Don't work with wet plants. You don't want to be spreading this bacteria. We want to make sure that we're rotating our crops. Rotate crops, that are in the same family every 2 to 3 years. Every 3 years, do not plant a plant that is in the same family in the same spot. And then again, destroy old plants after harvest for pest and disease control. This is a picture here. You can see the larva hiding on the midrib of the plant. Here's a picture of, I think these are probably looper eggs on a collard leaf. So here's BT. This is organically accepted. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. Bacterial, that can spray on the healthy leaves to kill the larva, or for our anthracnose or black rot. We have these copper fungicide that you can spray on the leaves, and you just want to blanket the leaf, make sure it's wet on both sides. You'd be spraying the healthy leaf. Again, they have natural enemies, and you can also exclude, the moths from laying the eggs. But if you do end up with a problem, you could spray BT, and that works only on the larval stage. It doesn't work on the adult moths. So I'm going to turn it back over to John here to talk about some lettuces and salad greens.
Thank you, Melissa. Just making sure I have my page up correctly. Okay, so some of the practices that we'll mention will be a bit similar, and some are pretty different than what we've talked about thus far. Later, we'll be talking a little bit about root vegetables, which are very different than lettuces and salad greens because of essentially their depth of root and how shallow or deep that plant is going to need its growing environment to be. So that being said, lettuce is really shallow rooted. Many types of crops, you would probably need to disturb the soil a little bit to cultivate and produce those things, but you don't really have to very much with lettuce. We'll end up talking about some pests and issues that lettuces do have shortly, but whereas they're not that susceptible to damage from soil disturbance, they are often a little bit more susceptible to pest damage. Again, they're right there by the ground. They're, nice tender leaves to be chewed on. So that's definitely something you'll have to consider. But we also, can direct your attention to some pest control resources we have as well. But soil is really going to be something that you have to be pretty intentional with how you manage when you're growing salad greens. So let me move forward to how to harvest lettuces. Leaf lettuces have a little bit more flexibility in how they're harvested than head lettuces do. But that being said, if you are harvesting leaf lettuces, you probably want to do so regularly. If anybody's paid attention to I'm trying to think of a good analysis here, but like livestock grazing on grass, those that cutting and damaging of the plant and some of the exchanges, in that case of the animal's enzymes in the plant, but in this case, rather just creating a growth response from that perceived damage can be really good for the plant's final yield. If you're regularly harvesting leaves that are, mid-size or bigger, you're going to get a bunch to eat or to sell, but you're also going to drive that plant to, respond by producing more and bigger leaves. So regular harvests are important. And then with leaf lettuce, and then head lettuce. Another good practice that some folks will employ when they're selling their head lettuces are to leave a few of those, a little bit more gnarly outer leaves, to kind of act as a shield for the more high quality inner leaves. You certainly don't have to do it, or you could even eat those leaves. But considering if you're going to be eating them yourself or selling them, or, certainly a lot of considerations with how you get those things out to the market. And then let's see, I know Melissa, you have a link here to some pest information. Do you want to cover that real quick before I move to the next plant?
Sure. I was gonna, so as John said, the cabbage looper, cutworms, beet armyworm, this is an excellent cooperative extension link that I wanted to show you. So here we're back at NC State Extension publications and insect and related pests of vegetables. And we're on pests of lettuce. So you can, the beet armyworm, it details it, gives you a picture of it, cabbage looper, cutworms, for more information. I also wanted to back up a page to show you what extension has to offer. Okay. Insects and related pests of vegetables, and there's eggplant, cucurbits, potatoes, sweet corn. I just, it's such a excellent resource that I wanted to point out. So I would encourage you to check out NC State Extension. But to check for the pests and how to control them on pests of lettuce. But again, in the fall, we're going to be having our mostly our chewing our worms to worry about. I also wanted to caution, well, with the cut and grow again lettuce, I do a lot of that, and if that is covered when it gets colder, you can have lettuce for all the way up until past Christmas. But I really want to emphasize drip irrigation if you can do that with the lettuce. Getting the lettuce, you have close spacing when you're doing the cut and grow again. And it's really easy to get some rot in the lettuce if they're spaced really closely. As John said, regular harvest is really important to keep that bed of lettuce really, really healthy.
Yeah, yeah. And so to kind of tie that to a couple of things that we're usually considering here with these webinars, folks, is just that there are a ton of resources, available, obviously with an extension. But I mean, we're not the sole provider of information here. But that being said, we want to direct people to things that are pretty infallible. We want to direct people to .edu resources. We don't want any conjecture whenever you're employing practices that are going to affect, your livelihood, your health, the things that you eat. So those resources on the NC State, pest control webpage through extension, all good options, but we do still encourage people to have integrated, ecologically sound approaches at all opportunities before you need to go find a pesticide. So a lot of what Melissa mentioned about, beneficials and creating environments where, these pests and pathogens aren't going to have much room to grow and thrive. Ideally, that's going to be the first step before a chemical solution. We
Yeah,
want
and row covers go a long way.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely, but mechanical solution or an environmental solution or a cultural solution, ideally before a chemical solution, which we'll definitely get into some of those topics a bit more as we go on. But now let's talk about a couple of the other common cool weather crops that are produced around here. Onions and garlic have quite a few similarities in their maintenance techniques and what you'll need to do to upkeep them. We'll focus on some of those commonalities, but also a few different things that make them unique from one another. Um, so when you are planting onions, you're either going to grow onions from seed, from transplants, or from sets. And sets are tiny, immature bulbs. Um, the different methods of planting are really going to vary depending upon the season, and the area that that specific type of onion is best suited for. Um, so that being said, you're probably going to be growing fall onions. So that's kind of the cool weather winter onions. So that's kind of the mindset that we're employing as we're talking about some of these. So considering when you're going to plant them for that harvest, um, let's see. Uh, Melissa, would you advance one slide for me? Thank you. So you can plant onions in fall or early spring. If you're growing them from transplants, you should probably plant them in early spring for best results. But considering that most of what we're doing right now is fall and winter, you want to be mindful of the environment, the planting method, and then the specific variety of onion that you have as well. So when you plant onions, ideally putting them in rows a couple feet apart is a good thing. It'll give you, ability to maintain those rows, but also, it's not like, again, a big, giant tomato vine that's going to take up a ton of space. So being mindful of how much space you're going to use to plant, to harvest, and also to employ maintenance practices. That's pretty important. Um, so let's see, depth wise, you're going to want to plant your sets a couple inches deep. Seeds are obviously, the smaller the seed, the less deep you want to plant it. So onion seeds can be pretty small. You don't want to plant them much more than half an inch or so deep. Um, Talking about some of the maintenance for onions, the closer you get to the ground, and when you're talking about onions and garlic and beets and radishes and root vegetables and stuff like that, you're in the ground. So weed control is a big deal. It's a bigger deal than it is with a lot of other things. I keep going back to that tomato plant. You can probably let the areas around your tomato plant get a little bit weedy without too much consequence. As always, a weedy, stagnant area is going to compete for, nutrients and sunlight and offer pests a place to live and all that. But it's worse whenever your entire plant is right in the middle of all of that non-ideal condition. So finding a weed control method that works for your circumstances, and that doesn't negatively impact the onions can be kind of difficult, because onions might require a little bit more direct attention than some of the other cool season crops. If you're growing on a small or even moderate scale, hand weeding is a pretty decent option for onions, as long as you're not disturbing that soil too deeply or too much. Um, Harvesting, onions take some unique care. And also, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Moisture is an important factor to pay attention to. Promoting a little bit of drying out of the neck of the onion, um, while not drying out the bulb, is kind of a necessary balance to achieve when you're harvesting onions. You don't want to dry, waterless onion to try to cut up and eat. But if you have a really um, juicy, neck of that plant, um, it can, it can kind of negatively impact the storing of that item, of that onion, after you harvest it. So that being said, pulling a little tiny bit of soil away from the bulbs when you know harvest time is coming up is a good way to let the top dry out without letting the deep desirable part dry out. Um, Switching from onions to garlic, and there are going to be some common things here. But garlic can be kind of temperamental. Um, Sufficient time for vegetative growth, and also, the development of that bulb, which, each of those elements are going to require some unique seasonal and environmental characteristics to function well. Because you need, that cool time and that moist time and that time when it's not so cool and moist, because they're pretty temperamental, it can be a challenge to produce garlic. It can be too wet, too dry, too cold. It's, or not as often too cold around here, but that's certainly a thing. And early fall planting is usually pretty ideal to grow the healthiest garlic plants, in this area. Um, Considering some of the additional maintenance, that I mentioned, and how some of the things that we're going to want to do for healthy plants are not necessarily plant specific, but rather specific to the soil and the growing environment. Garlic is one that can really benefit from just a little bit of, a little bit of extra love in the form of a layer of mulch. Um, with bulbs like garlic that can be so temperamental in regard to soil moisture, mulching can really promote a necessary degree of consistent moisture retention that's going to be really, really important for garlic plants. Onion plants too, but in my experience, garlic can be super temperamental. Um, Harvesting garlic, a good thing to do before you just say, hey, it's harvesting day. A good thing to do is pull out a test bulb. Not a bad idea with really any root. But essentially pulling out a test bulb, then you can look at it and see, okay, the roots have been growing well. It is a good size and shape, and I pulled this from right in the middle of my row. Chances are most of the things around this are going to be similar. Um, you don't necessarily need to eat a test tomato, but you probably ought to pull a test garlic bulb, before you decide to harvest everything. I think, yeah, last thing I want to cover today, last specific crop that I want to cover today, but I do want to talk a little bit about some of those all-encompassing practices as well. Um, so beets, another root vegetable. They grow really well around here in the fall. Also, they can do pretty well in spring too. It's really fun to play with seasonality. I encourage you to, test and see what grows well in your area. But generally speaking, beets aren't going to tolerate hot weather. Not designed for it. They're, you know, you can probably find better things to do than root vegetables if it's a hot late summer, or whenever you're trying to plant, you want to be mindful of temperature. But that being said, one of the cool things about beets is they don't have a whole lot of common problems as they reach maturity. There's just more environmental problems when they're younger. So direct seeding is probably your best bet with beets. If you were to start them somewhere and then transplant them, it could really, specifically to beets, really get in the way of the development of the roots. So direct seeding, and then thinning a little bit is really a good idea. And then, you can plant them in a lot of places. I've had them grow well in container gardens, raised beds, you can grow them as field crops. You can grow them in small spaces. I almost in this slide wrote cramped spaces, which I didn't want to say cramped spaces because if you don't have enough soil for that beet to grow deep and wide, then it's really going to hurt it. But if you have a space, in your garden or yard or something, that no other crop is really going to do too well in, you can probably I don't want to say, again, I don't want to say pack some beets in there, but you can probably grow some beets pretty well on a really small scale, whereas you can't with a lot of other things. So a couple more things about beets. Considering planting, be mindful that some varieties of beets have roots that can grow, more than a couple feet long. So paying attention to the depth, if you are in a garden bed that's, maybe it's rocky below the bed or something, it's maybe not your best place for beets. Be mindful of depth, texture, tree roots, that's a big one. Tree roots like to creep out kind of laterally, and shallowly. So if you're probably not going to want to plant your beets, even though they can tolerate partial shade. Don't plant them near trees because those tree roots are really going to get in the way of the beet roots. Um, if adequate moisture is there, beet roots can grow, more than 3 feet long in the soil. It really depends on the environment more than a lot of other plants. They like a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus. Please do not apply nitrogen and phosphorus until you know how much nitrogen and phosphorus is in the soil already. Um, do not work the soil more than an inch or two deep like you wouldn't with the onions. And then as soon as those beets get crowded, if you have direct seeded, you're going to want to start thinning them out a little bit. A beet seed is actually kind of a cluster of seeds. So you'll probably get a few plants off of a seed, and thus you will likely need to thin them. Also, if you have not eaten the greens off of beets, those are starting to get a little bit more popular, and they're actually really delicious and a good nutritionally dense thing to eat if you were just going to throw it away and eat the root.
They're so good. I grow them just for the tops.
Give me the roots if you want to eat the tops. We can achieve something there. But yeah, beetroot and the greens are awesome.
They're both good, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then considering harvesting, a couple of unique harvesting considerations here as well. Couple months after germination, depending upon what the variety is usually going to want when you're going to want to pull those beets. And then, it's kind of like if you've ever changed a tire on a car, like loosening the lug nuts, like you're not going to want to do A and then B and then C and then D because you'll kind of create, one area that has a little more pressure on it and the other that does not. Kind of similar in how you're harvesting beets. If you harvest every single one, then maybe you need 50 beets, and if you harvest beets 1 through 50, then beets 51 through 100 are going to have much less space than 1 through 50. So 2, 4, 6, 8 is going to give the odd numbers more room to expand for a later harvest. So don't pull by section, pull intermittently or incrementally, or however you want to say that. I hope that was clear. I think that came across clearly. um, so um, Another big one is take the greens off when you harvest them. Whether you're going to eat them immediately or sell them at the market, take the greens off because that desirable edible root is going to continue being depleted by the growing greens of its nutrients, if you do not sever that. So quickly, because I do want to have time for a little bit of Q&A at the end, I want to just talk about a couple of general principles that are necessary to pay attention to no matter what you are growing. Um, Reduce your plant stress, build healthy soils, and pay attention to the health of your soil all the time. And then a function or a factor in soil health is crop rotation. That's a very big thing. Living roots within the soil, particularly ones that cannot sequentially exchange pathogens one after another, is a really important thing to do to care for the earth in which you are growing your plants. Please don't take that for granted. So some of the ways to reduce plant stress, or some of the factors of plant stress, if that thing is not healthy, then it is not soaking up sunlight and growing effectively. And if it is not doing those things, then it is a weak straggler that pests and other pathogens can begin to invade. So really a stressed out plant is like the first thing that you want to really kind of use as a cue, but also to avoid, because that can be a Trojan horse for other problems. Um, drought, excessive moisture, too acidic or too alkaline soils, nutrient deficiencies. There's shallow planting, soil compaction. Those are mechanical, those are environmental. There's a lot of different types of stressors that if you don't do those things, then you are going to have to spend less time, at your nursery finding pesticides to combat the things that come in after that. Healthy soils, anybody who's interested, I'll point you towards resources. Melissa or I are both soil people. So that being said,
That's
please test
actually our
your.
next,
Yes, yes. Next webinar. Great plug, Melissa. We'll be talking about soil health soon. Um, but test your soils, and once you have them tested, then you can manage the nutrients and the pH. Please, you cannot manage your nutrients and your pH if you do not know what those levels are prior to doing something. So do that. Organic matter is something very good. It drives decomposition. If you've got leaves or manure or compost, a lot of those things can be very helpful, but it is also very necessary to know the composition of the things you are putting on your soil as well. Manure, often very good. Not very good if you have an excessive amount of phosphorus and that manure is high in phosphorus. You can burn a lot of your stuff. And organic matter is good, but just know what it is and what it's going to do to your soil before adding it. Crop rotation, we'll talk about for 1 second, which is essentially not planting the same crops in the same family year after year. Some plants can fix nitrogen or essentially absorb nitrogen from the atmosphere and put it into the soil. Some plants are high consumers of nitrogen. Some plants, maybe a radish or a beet might do a good job of reducing compaction in that soil before the season where you might want to plant something that can't survive in compacted soils. So this is a whole lesson in itself. We'll talk about this a little more when we cover soil health later. Um, and then I have been talking a lot. Melissa, would you finish us out before we take some questions?
yeah, I think we're pretty much out of time. Just wanted to mention, the NC State Plant and Disease Clinic. If you have a problem with what you're growing and can't figure it out, you can submit a sample to the Plant and Disease Clinic. I don't have time to go through all these, but if you click on this link here, it will detail, it's basically what I have on the slide here, but it will detail how you submit a sample. So just encourage you to do that. We wanted to mention our upcoming webinar in October. We're going to be talking about cover crops, how they're important for soil health. Crop rotation, we'll also mention that. We're going to focus on cover crops and seeding rates at a small scale. I think cover crops are applicable and beneficial no matter your scale. Even raised beds, you can plant cover crops in there too. Cover crops are beneficial above ground and below ground. And then in December, we're gonna delve a little into season extension, indoor production, do it yourself high tunnels or caterpillar tunnels, even covering a raised bed to extend your season. I no longer have my chat box up. I'm not sure what happened to it. If we
Uh,
have a couple time for some questions, you
I'm
can email
covering.
either
Oh,
John or I. Yeah, go ahead if you see some
no,
questions.
absolutely. I've been covering a couple via text, but just ones that are necessary to address that the group might appreciate. Um, Elisa mentioned planting onion sets or seeds next to existing summer crops. You can plant onions among existing other crops. I don't want to mention specific companion planting principles right now because I'm not positive what's going to grow well with each other, but you can very successfully, because you don't have to disturb very much to plant an onion, pop some sets in the ground near other stuff. Just be mindful of competition for resources. Um,
Or
let's
disturbing the
see.
onions when you're removing the other crop.
That's a huge one too. More likely if they're going to grow well around things that are where you're probably not going to have to uproot the entire crop upon harvest. That's very important. Um, I see that Leon had a question about height for row cover.
Oh,
Melissa, got any ideas for maybe any of the things we talked about today? Low-lying plants and row cover?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing with row cover is just to keep it not touching the plants. I think, in the spring or summer, you can be more liberal with how close it is to the plant. I've seen, in the late spring, early summer, excluding moths, on plants that the row cover can just be laid over the plants. But when we're talking about fall, I worry about moisture and condensation on the row cover, and I'd want to keep it off the plants. I often just use thin gauge PVC poles and make a little arch, and then you can use binder clips to attach the row cover to the PVC, so you have like a little dome. Say if you're in a garden row or a raised bed, you just make like a little tunnel with your PVC and row cover. So I think that you should keep it off the plants, but there's no magic height really for the row cover. You're
Yeah.
just covering the plants to exclude. It's a mechanical barrier to exclude pests
Yeah, and if
or
it's
frost or
touching that
frost.
wall, if the plant is touching that cover that has condensation on it, that could be damaging to the plant as well.
Yeah.
So
So if you're using it as frost, I would want to keep it off the plant. But like in the dry early spring, early summer, I don't think it matters because then that you're just excluding the moths
absolutely, absolutely.
or flea
And then I
beetles.
think I think we're touching most of these. Let's see, other questions for the last minute or two. So somebody asked about fertilizing with nitrogen when you're growing a couple of specific root vegetables because that would promote vegetative growth and not that generative growth that we're going for. It's going to 100% depend on timing, existing fertility, and that plant's, that how mature that plant is and what its fertility needs are as well. I would not say to avoid fertilizers with carrots or beets. I would just say be very mindful of applying the correct amount at the correct time in the correct place. And then you can probably still promote the type of growth that you want to achieve. I know we're at 101 here. That's too late for our folks who joined. So if anybody has any other questions, either of these email addresses, we're both happy to help you. Or if you are throughout the state of North Carolina, your local cooperative extension office, there's one in every county, should hopefully be able to address some of these resources. We're always happy to be there for you guys. And if anybody would like to attend, we would hope to have you at our October webinar where we talk a little bit more about cover crops and soils. Thank you all so much for listening. The quality of these webinars are the result of the people who choose to attend and support. So thank you all.
Yes, thank you. If you will receive a recording in your wrap-up email, but if you would also like a slide deck, you can email us and we can send you the slides after we clean them up a little bit.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Melissa, Calliope, the folks over at Cephs. Always a pleasure to do these. We look forward to seeing you all in the next one.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, guys.